Well, we are joined through Skype by Mark Taliano, and we're going to be speaking about Syria, and in particular his book, Voices from Syria, which has just come out this year. Mark Taliano is a former high school teacher, an author, and an independent investigative reporter, as well as a research associate with the Center for Research on Globalization. In September of 2016, Mark traveled to Syria, and where he was able to corroborate some of his own research into the Syrian conflict and the distortions of reality presented in mainstream and some alternative media discourse. And so Mark Taliano is joining us from Hamilton. So welcome, Mark Taliano.
Hi, Michael. Nice to be with you. I've seen some of your shows. I really enjoy them.
Okay, great. Appreciate it. Now, I guess just to start, when you started to question the official account of Syria and what's been going on there, can I ask, maybe where you started to have doubts about the official story, maybe what your sources of information were?
Well, I'd read a lot of Michel Chossudovsky's book, but a lot of his books, and he explains it quite clearly that this campaign, this strategy of using proxies, so-called Islamic militants, there's nothing new about it. But they're not, I don't want to get into these sectarian labels, because I don't see these terrorists as representative at all of Islam, and they aren't, in fact. It's the Wahhabi strain, but they're mercenaries. They're mercenary terrorists. Anyways, I read a fair bit, and we all know that there were Bush and his entourage told about 900 some odd lies about Iraq. We know that the weapons of mass destruction was as a fake pretext for the war. It just wasn't true. And I know, and a lot of us know, that in Libya we were basically the Air Force for Al Qaeda troops, and we know that in Iraq that Al Qaeda was operating as well. And we also know that prior to the invasion of Iraq, for example, Al Qaeda did not have a presence in Iraq. It wasn't there. And we know that Gaddafi, who raised the Human Development Index of Libya to the highest in Africa, we know that he was combating Al Qaeda type troops on the ground. And we know now that those were proxies for the U.S. empire. And we know that in Afghanistan, the forces assembled by the empire were the same type of proxies, foot soldiers. They're mercenary terrorists. They're paid well to do what they do. And they infect countries, prey countries, if you will, targeted countries, with total and complete destruction and unthinkable, unimaginable crimes. And I have seen this, and then there's these expressions about people sticking their head down a rabbit hole. Okay, we've seen this so many times. Certainly people should have remembered all the lies as fake pretext to the war on Iraq. And so it seemed quite clear that the same thing was going on in Syria. Mm-hmm. And I think that people would see it as clearly as that if they would turn off the television and not read the newspapers, which is asking a lot.
Mark, could I ask you to maybe share a particular anecdote? I mean, you were there in September.
Yes.
And I was wondering if there's something that could really impress on our listeners, just the extent of the ordeal that they endured.
It's horrible. Every story that's in the book is really horrible. Lily Martin is and then the other thing here is, Lily Martin, for example, who's in my book, and I use some of her testimonies, and I always corroborate all the testimonies. She's a permanent resident in Syria, but she's also an American citizen. And so the U.S. empire has citizens living in Syria who have to withstand this. And so this comes from Lily Martin, permanent resident in Syria, who happens also to be an American citizen. And this is what and this is what happened. She writes about why she could not vote for Hillary Clinton. And this is what she said. She meaning Hillary Clinton, she personally oversaw the transfer of weapons from Libya to Turkey to be used specifically by the American-backed terrorists who destroyed my own home on March 21st, 2014, and beheaded my Christian neighbors, and raped the old ladies who they kidnapped and took to Turkey, and killed others, and destroyed the whole village of Kasab, Syria. This is not a rumor. This is a fact. Lily writes, this is well documented in her time as Secretary of State. So what Lily, I mean, it's disgusting, but every single story that I heard is disgusting. That's the story. I mean, that's just one of many, many, many stories that these people have to, of life that these people have to endure thanks to us, thanks to the West, thanks to the NATO terrorists. And what Lily is referring to there is the weapons rat line from Libya early in the war. The weapons rat line that came from Libya's looted armories all the way to Syria. And some people think that that's part of the reason why Libya was destroyed. And it probably was. That's one of many reasons, and every reason was a bad reason.
Is there anything that comes out of, I know that Aleppo had been occupied for some time by the al-Nusra and ISIS forces, and a lot of people were forced, basically kidnapped and not allowed to escape. Did you hear any reports from out of there?
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, in Aleppo was liberated, and then all sorts of evidence came out that confirmed what documentation has confirmed, which is all these terrorists, they're just one and the same. They're all Al-Qaeda affiliates. They're all linked to Al-Qaeda, including ISIS. And for example, you had the FSA, you had Daesh, you had all sorts of different groups coming together in a part of Aleppo that they occupied, and they worked together, and they hoarded medicine that was, given to them from our governments, and they hoarded food, and they launched ordnance filled with explosives and nails and poison gas regularly, all the time, into the parts of Aleppo that were not occupied. And when people tried to leave through these corridors, which the terrorists mined, they were shot. So people couldn't leave. They were totally captive, and all sorts of coercive methods were used to have these people trained basically as slaves. Do what we say or we kill you, literally. And the terrorists, as policy, they use hospitals, they occupy hospitals, and typically because they're very solid buildings, but also they're protected. And we've seen all the public relations about that. But they occupy hospitals, they get their medicines there, and they create jail cells in the hospital building, and they put victims in the jail cells, and they torture them there, and they execute people, and they have sniper perches on the top of the hospitals often. So these hospitals are used as command posts, as torture centers, Sharia law courts. That's where they hoard food and medicine. That's often the base from which these terrorists operate. and the rest of the Aleppo population is captive.
Yeah.
Like the occupied parts of say East Aleppo, the occupied parts where the terrorists, they didn't occupy all of Aleppo. They weren't able to do so, but the parts that they did occupy, the people didn't want them there, and the people were captive.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't hear these stories, and all these stories are corroborated by numerous sources.
But Mark,
yeah.
I was wondering if you could, because I mean, a lot of the entities that are promoting these ideas, the talk about the violence of the Syrian Air Force and the Russians in Aleppo, but and elsewhere, they're being disseminated by groups that are highly esteemed: Amnesty International, Médecins Sans Frontières, Avaz have been very on top of that anti-Assad campaign. I was wondering if you could maybe, try to account for people who hold those entities in such high esteem. I mean, how do you explain to them that these accounts are inaccurate, and how do you make sense of that?
This is the new way that empire works. They corrupt agencies. Now, none of these so-called non-governmental agencies are non-governmental. They're all governmental. They're funded by the government and foundations. And there's a revolving door often between the board of directors and the State Department. For example, Susan Nossel was with the U.S. government, and then she transferred over to Amnesty International. So all these and all these groups, they are an appendage of empire because they are embedded with the terrorists, and that includes the white helmets. The white helmets are actually Al Qaeda.
Yeah,
and that's hard for a lot of people to swallow, especially since the white helmets won an Oscar. Vanessa Billy's done a wonderful work for this, and the bottom line is, for example, Bana Al-Abed, her parents are Al Qaeda. Mm-hmm. And Vanessa Billy went to where Bana Al-Abed's parents were tweeting, because all these terrorist groups have their own media centers. It's a real super information corruption type of process. So Vanessa Billy went there, and where this young girl was, where her parents were and where she was, is very close to a center where they repaired these hell cannons. They repaired weapons for the terrorists. And her father, the girl's father, was a Sharia court judge. And at one time it was Al-Qaeda type groups in there, and then ISIS, which they're basically all affiliated anyways. So what we have here is this whole complex of non-governmental agencies, Amnesty International, Avaz. They're all governmental. They're all embedded with the terrorists, and they're supported by foundation money as well. And they are the source for our mainstream media stories.
Yeah, Mark, as a result of these mechanisms, like the foundation-funded NGOs and those media centers you mentioned, you've seen this propaganda matrix, and I'm really astonished by the extent to which the left and the anti-war movement has been corrupted. I mean, I know that. I mean, astonishingly enough, like at the outset, you talked about Iraq. And my sense was that there was broad opposition to the Iraq War, and this is only 2 years or less than 2 years after 9/11, and now there's hardly any anti-war campaign against Syria in sight. So it's really quite remarkable. I mean, is there anything more you could say about this? The extent to which the success of this interference, this confusion within Syria solidarity circles, the usual suspects.
Yeah, it's astonishing. It is really astonishing because, as you said, Iraq, there were huge protests. basically the left, well, if you want to call them left, or the so-called progressives, they aren't progressives if they support the terrorists invading Syria, if they support imperialism, and a lot of them do. And a lot of them are confused probably, and a lot of them probably believe the mainstream messaging. But after 7 years of war, I don't think it's a valid excuse anymore. And I think that, well, for example, in the book, I demonstrate that the war on terror is a complete fraud because the terrorists are our proxies. And I think really that there's too many taboo topics out there that are necessarily not being addressed. And I think 9/11 is a big one. And I think that we have to address the 9/11 false flag to understand how our populations have been deceived, how the progressives are not progressives at all. If you can't identify the root problem is not refugees. The root problem is what creates the refugees, which are these illegal wars. And people need to understand that these wars are not humanitarian. There's nothing humanitarian about it. And people have a hard time maybe accepting the fact that what their government tells them about these wars is basically the opposite to what is really happening. And people, I mean, I think this is unprecedented. The amount of lies about the war on Syria, I think is basically unprecedented. Prof. Tim Anderson would agree. He wrote a book on it as well. I think we have to address these taboo topics, including 9/11. Mm-hmm. Because after 9/11, this war on terror, which is a war for terror, literally, all of these invasions have accelerated. Afghanistan didn't attack us, and Afghanistan was attacked. I mean, none of these countries attacked us. So, I mean, now the truth is coming out, but, well, it's been coming out for 7 years. But now that liberated areas are, now that the devastation is there, and some of us are on the ground, Vanessa Beeley, Eva Bartlett, Tim Anderson, Janice Courtcamp, I was there, and I hope to go back. We're taking pictures. There's people on the ground right now. Janice is there. Tim is there. And they see these huge arsenals of weaponry, all NATO weaponry that ISIS and the other terrorists left behind in their rush to leave. So the evidence, primary source evidence, is overwhelming.
Mark, I wanted to just bring to your attention, I mean, there's a couple of familiar talking points that's adding to the confusion on the anti-imperialist left. For one thing, as you recall, Maher Arar was sent to rendition to Syria, where he was tortured. So that's one thing that a lot of activists are mindful of. There's also this idea of the Arab Spring and the Daraa in Daraa, where there was this major uprising, and apparently or supposedly the Syrian armed forces attacked peaceful protesters. So I'm wondering if, just before we kind of close this discussion, if you'd like to address those two.
Yeah, well, it was an intelligence operation from the beginning. It's similar to these. Okay, so what happened in Daraa is, as I mentioned earlier, the weapons were already there. They had weapons. It's an intelligence operation. And people were protesting in Syria, as they do in other countries, peacefully. There were polls done from both sides, and they didn't want violence. The people did not want violence. But as was the case with Ukraine, and as was the case with other so-called uprisings, militants were inserted into it, and they would provoke violence, and they would shoot at police. And the police, people won't believe this, but the police were ordered to not carry arms. Okay, and the police were being slaughtered. And this is well documented in the book. So we have outsiders coming in, instigating violence to create a fake revolution.
Could you address the point about Maher Arar and feelings, how that colors people's thinking about Assad?
Well, okay, so the empire tortures people all over the world, but they like to work. CIA likes to work beneath the mantle of plausible deniability, so they would often outsource the torture. So this ties in with the Arar story, where the torture is outsourced. Now, bear in mind that the empire, it can be very, very coercive. If a country such as Syria stands up to the empire and says, "No, we don't want this. No, we resist your overtures. No, we do not want ISIS, Al Qaeda to govern us." The empire can be very, very coercive. They have a whole raft of, they have these mercenaries, and they destroy countries that stand up to empire. They destroyed Libya, Iraq, Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So if the empire demands, well, guess what? I want you to torture so-and-so, that can be pretty coercive.
Okay. Well, Mark, I think we got to leave it there, but I just want to remind folks again that the book is Voices from Syria, and it's just published earlier this year, and you can purchase it from the Center for Research on Globalization at globalresearch.ca. But thank you again for agreeing to this interview.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be speaking with you.
So we've been speaking with, his name is Mark Taliano, and he is a author and independent investigative reporter, as well as a research associate with the Center for Research on Globalization, and he joined us from Hamilton, Ontario.